los ciudadanos entender lo que sus gobiernos hacen e influir así en las decisiones. Los gobiernos se encuentran cada vez más también alineados en fortalecer su compromiso con la transparencia, luchar contra la corrupción, empoderar a los ciudadanos y aprovechar a las nuevas tecnologías para un gobierno más eficaz y responsable. En este sentido, recolectan y almacenan datos personales y los ciudadanos tienen derecho a solicitar información sobre las actividades gubernamentales, promoviendo un mayor acceso a la información. La adopción de políticas y estrategias de datos abiertos es quizás uno de los enfoques más innovadores para aprovechar las nuevas tecnologías en materia de disponibilidad de información. Proporcionar activamente información de alto valor, incluidos los datos primarios, de manera oportuna, en formatos que el público pueda encontrar, comprender y utilizar fácilmente y que además simplifiquen su reutilización. Sin embargo, la enorme cantidad de información y de capacidad de reutilización obliga a realizar un balance entre la confidencialidad de la información, la existencia de un marco jurídico adecuado para hacer pública la información y los principios que hacen a un buen gobierno. El presente panel tiene como objetivo analizar el impacto que tiene la mayor apertura en el gobierno, en la relación de la confidencialidad y los datos personales, y qué tipo de medidas se deberían adoptar para lograr el referido balance. Para conducir este panel, invitamos entonces al señor Iñaki Vicuña de Nicolás, director del Centro de Documentación del Poder Judicial de España, especialista en protección de datos. En la mesa lo acompañan los expositores Javier Ruiz Díaz, miembro de Open Right Group del Reino Unido, Alfonso Oñate Laborde de IFAI México, David Banizar, asesor legal del artículo 19, Campaña Global para la Libertad de Expresión, y Christopher Graham, comisionado de ICO, Autoridad del Reino Unido en Transparencia y Protección de Datos. Quedan ustedes con el señor Iñaki. Adelante.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias. En primer lugar, agradecerles su presencia y pedirles disculpas porque empezamos más tarde, pero bueno, venimos arrastrando tiempo desde primera hora de la mañana. Y también agradecerles su presencia porque la hora es muy mala. Hemos comido muy bien y hay que hacer un verdadero esfuerzo por mantenerse aquí. También hay unas circunstancias externas que es el vendaval que nos hacen que estemos aquí mejor que en el exterior, ¿no? Bueno, pues aparte de agradecerle su presencia, también quiero agradecer a GESIC y a la Unidad Reguladora de Control de Datos Personales, sobre todo a Felipe Rotondo, a Federico Monteverde y a José Klastornik por la invitación que nos han hecho a participar en esta mesa, y también a María José Viega y todo el equipo aquí presente que han trabajado para que se pueda celebrar esta conferencia. Contamos con excelentes panelistas que vienen de países que cuentan ya con una experiencia muy fuerte en el tema que nos ocupa, en Open Government. Y para ello me van a permitir que haga una pequeña presentación y que al final lance unas preguntas que la organización nos hace para que cada uno de los representantes aquí presentes haga una exposición de su experiencia y cuenten cómo lo ven desde sus respectivos países. En primer lugar, con una breve referencia de qué trata, como bien nos ha presentado el presentador, esta mesa sobre Open Government, sobre gobierno abierto, aunque se solapa con otros conceptos también actuales como gobierno electrónico, buen gobierno, pero es una cuestión más específica. Y más específica también teniendo en cuenta cómo ha empezado este fenómeno, que es fruto de una evolución que se produce a partir de la segunda parte del siglo XX, con diferentes legislaciones de acceso a información por parte, sobre todo, de Estados Unidos, de Inglaterra, de Francia, y toda la incorporación de los países de América a toda la legislación de acceso y transparencia de la información, con la gran experiencia aquí presente de México en esta mesa. Se viene a centrar Open Government sobre todo con el memorando de transparencia y gobierno abierto del presidente americano Barack Obama de enero del 2009, pero ya digo que recoge todos los antecedentes a lo que estamos hablando. Y con tres conceptos principales: transparencia, colaboración y participación. Transparencia en lo que ha sido la cuestión principal, que es rendir cuentas, el accountability, y después también información sobre planes. Pero también el acceso a la información y reutilización mediante la apertura de datos públicos, que es lo que más nos ocupa hoy, ¿no? Ese es, para mí, el pilar que sustenta todo el edificio. Y después también, en esta nueva sociedad que se ha generado, con toda la demanda, también por parte de administraciones públicas y de ciudadanos, a la colaboración, con la implicación y compromiso con ciudadanos, con empresas y con asociaciones para ir sumando en un esfuerzo común, ¿no? Y la participación como un eje que favorece participar activamente en la conformación de las políticas públicas. Se trata, a fin de cuentas, en mejorar la calidad, la eficacia y la eficiencia, partiendo de los principios de transparencia, equidad y protección de datos, que es el tema que ocupa la conferencia, ¿no? Se da a la vez un fenómeno en los últimos tiempos, que es la injerencia de las nuevas tecnologías, la injerencia de Internet, la injerencia de las TIC y el gran desarrollo de esta cultura digital, que son claves para entender este gobierno abierto, este Open Government. En cuanto a las referencias, todas de hace muy pocos años, ya digo, porque es cuando se ha producido el fenómeno, nos vamos a referir más concretamente a lo que significa toda la reutilización de la información pública. Desde la visión europea, con la Directiva Europea del 2003, pero con las diferentes políticas que en la Unión Europea se han ido produciendo, desde la Declaración de Malmö del 2009, la Declaración Ministerial de Granada, la Agenda Digital Europea, y constituye en el año 2010 una acción clave, como dice la Agenda Digital Europea, la revisión de la Directiva sobre reutilización de la información del sector público. Es ahora, en ese momento, en el que se encuentra Europa, en esa revisión, en esa propuesta de directiva del Parlamento Europeo y del Consejo para esta modificación de la directiva. Esta modificación de la directiva, que no olvidemos, estamos en la Conferencia Internacional de Privacidad, pero que entra, y así lo dice expresamente el dictamen del Comité Económico y Social, diciendo que no altera ni menoscaba en modo alguno el nivel de protección de las personas físicas en lo que respecta al tratamiento de datos personales. Es decir, el marco general de protección de los datos personales dentro de la reutilización de la información pública seguirá estando en la Directiva Europea, en el próximo reglamento que va a sustituir a la directiva. Por hacer, ya digo, una breve transcripción, empieza en Europa con el Libro Verde de la Comisión Europea del año 98, está la Directiva del año 2003, la importante Conferencia de la Organización de Cooperación y Desarrollo de la OCDE del 2008 y esto desemboca con el memorándum, ya decía, sobre la transparencia y gobierno abierto del Gobierno de Barack Obama. ¿Qué está pasando ahora, justo en este momento, y por qué nos trae aquí? El impulso que se da en la política de gobierno abierto, las iniciativas de la ciudadanía, la sociedad civil, los infomediarios con esa demanda de información pública, las plataformas Open Data que se han ido generando en todos nuestros países, en cada uno de nuestros países hay una experiencia al respecto, y las posibilidades de la web 2.0 y las tecnologías móviles. También conviene resaltar la conciencia y el valor económico que se le da a la reutilización de estos datos. ¿Y qué subyace en esta filosofía de Open Data? En esta filosofía de Open Data y de reutilización hay que tener en cuenta que al final se trata de ponderar una serie de equilibrios, derechos fundamentales que a veces podían parecer contrapuestos y vienen en un mismo paquete. El derecho de acceso a la información, la libertad de información, la protección de datos personales e incluso otros aspectos que hay que analizarlas con la misma visión, toda la legislación en materia de secretos oficiales, seguridad, propiedad intelectual, etcétera. Es decir, estamos en una sociedad compleja que necesita cambiar y mezclar todos estos valores. Nosotros, evidentemente, lo analizamos en esta conferencia desde la óptica de la protección de datos personales. Pero también no es que exista esta demanda de información, de reutilización de la información pública, sino que también es la propia información de las administraciones públicas, las propias administraciones y las instituciones los que deben cambiar su forma de trabajar. Y en esta filosofía cambia el concepto de servicio público, o no es que cambie exactamente, sino que se le da una vertiente nueva, el interés público, el desarrollo del conocimiento, el crecimiento económico, la creación de empleo, la apertura y la participación democrática. Y, en concreto, en un mundo globalizado, conviene analizar los problemas globalizadamente, ¿no? Y esta armonización de todo el sector público, este uso transfronterizo de la información y esta generación de valores añadidos no pueden perder esa óptica de un mundo totalmente conectado, de un mundo global y de un crecimiento económico. Los marcos conceptuales que se están replanteando ahora deberán contribuir a qué? Al desarrollo de la ley de acceso, de la normativa de acceso de la información y de la libertad de prensa, a la normativa de la privacidad, a la normativa y el cambio del procedimiento administrativo que posibilite todo reutilización de la información pública y, sobre todo, también al control de las entidades fiscalizadoras. En fin, se trata de los desafíos, los retos que tenemos en una sociedad como la actual, que nunca se había presentado un contexto así, vienen a analizar la transparencia y el debate público como un desarrollo de la propia democracia, la modernización del Estado, la innovación y el apoyo en la economía digital, los beneficios económicos de la transparencia, y un nuevo modelo de acción pública, un modelo de Estado de plataforma digital, unos estándares abiertos, una planificación preocupándose de la participación ciudadana y un aprender observando a los propios usuarios, esa mezcla de lo público con lo privado, teniendo en cuenta que se genera riqueza. Al final, se trata de reducir las barreras y de dirigir las administraciones públicas dando un ejemplo de esto: respeto a los ciudadanos, respeto de los derechos fundamentales y respeto al acceso a la libertad y al buen gobierno. Para ello contamos, ya digo, con 4 expertos con experiencias diferentes, y la pregunta que desde la organización les hacemos vendrían a analizar dentro de su exposición 3 preguntas básicas, ¿no? En primer lugar, ¿se toma en cuenta la protección de datos personales en la aplicación de las políticas de datos abiertos? ¿Cuáles son sus potenciales peligros? En diferentes acciones de cada una de las experiencias que aquí se verán, pues se analizará cómo se ha hecho esto. ¿Qué medidas se han tomado para lograr el balance, la ponderación entre la publicación de datos abiertos y la protección de datos personales? Y, en tercer lugar, ¿existen experiencias en derecho comparado que den solución a esta problemática, tales como las cláusulas o pautas para reutilizar la información? Este es el debate que va a animar esta mesa. Y yo quiero contarles mi experiencia personal del último mes dirigiendo la jurisprudencia la organización de la jurisprudencia en España, donde se ponderan estos derechos y, por una parte, se reutilizan y se dan en abierto 5 millones de sentencias sin datos personales, lo cual pues, es ponderar ese derecho a la transparencia, esa reutilización de la información y, por otra parte, proteger los datos personales, datos tan importantes como son los datos de las sentencias. Y, sin más, pues doy la palabra a nuestro primer ponente, que, según el orden de presentación, Javier Ruiz Díaz, del Reino Unido. ¿Dónde quieras? ¿Dónde? No sé. ¿No te han pasado?
Hello, hi. I will speak in English for the translators. And yeah, I think just before we go into answering some of these questions, I wanted to set just like some of the basics of what we are talking about in terms of open data and open government. Yeah. So first, Sorry, ¿me puedes mover para cambiar?
Para cambiar.
How do we change the? Sorry, there's a problem with the slides. Mm-hmm. But just to understand, when we look at open data, we are actually looking at several layers of rights and frameworks. So as David and others will probably explain later on, we are starting our initial point. Yeah. Oh, sorry, it didn't work anyway. So our initial point would be right to information law and access to information legislation. So that would be the first, the starting point for defining open data. Then we will see how that conflicts with data protection. But more importantly, and something that has been mentioned before, is the right to reuse. And that introduces a completely new aspect that is not contemplated strictly when we look at the discussions around the right to information itself. So reuse is framed in Europe and other places not as not only in terms of transparency, but it's also framed in terms of economic development, and also around competition law and avoiding state monopolies and the development of private monopolies of public information. And that is something very important to understand, so we don't try to ask the wrong questions. So public sector regulations, public sector information regulations will not tell us anything about access to information. They sit right above, and that's something that we have to be very clear. Something to understand is that access to right to reuse information is still not strictly the same as open data. You can still apply some restrictions on how the information is reused. You could ask people to sign contracts. You could have specific clauses about privacy or other aspects that you wouldn't have in open data. And in the European framework, also something very important to understand is that the way that the new directive for reuse of information is drafted, it specifically excludes information that is obtained under data protection subject access requests. It's not data where you have to prove a specific purpose, like being the owner of the data, is excluded from reuse. So it's only data that comes from pure access to information laws that is under the reuse framework. That's something. So in other countries, I mean, I'm talking from the European perspective. In the US, reuse is not regulated in the same way as in Europe, and there it started simply through the lack of intellectual protection on federal information, which led to things like maps and many other things, and court orders being reusable automatically and developing an industry around that. In Europe, many countries and companies are looking at the US as a model of what can be done with public data. But we need to understand that we are working under very, very different frameworks. So then the next layer would be pure open data, and what we are talking about here. And here, what we need to understand is that open data is data that you put online and is open. And open means that there are no restrictions, at least in the definition of openness. Yeah. So open data will have a proactive release. You know, it's not about waiting and access to information. It's about getting the information out there in a comprehensive manner and, you know, without any control. It's about technical formats, about making the information reusable by putting it in open formats. And it's also about licensing, and particularly something that is very important to understand when, in terms of data protection. Advocates of open data, or many of them, not all, you know, will say that open data is only open if there are no restrictions on the purpose and no restrictions on the identity of the reuser. So this is what is called non-discriminatory licensing. And that, of course, creates quite, as you can imagine, lots of problems in terms of data protection. No? So, and then the way we would see open data is not as an end in itself. I mean, we think that, yeah, it can generate economic development, but fundamentally is a core building block for open government and having a completely different relationship between government and citizens. And that is something that for us is also important to keep in mind. You know? Even when the public sector information regulations frame PSI under an under economics, we will see it ultimately about open government and going back to the initial right to information question, but in a very indirect way. So, again, another slide that didn't work, no worries. So just to give a very, very basic typology on when we talk about open data, we would say that there are four, you know, and this is a completely arbitrary classification, if you want, four key types of public data. One would be core reference data, such as maps, business registers, and information that is unique, that the state is serving a specific function of providing a unique reference. And that information tends to have high economic value and is normally not considered to have a high transparency value, but in our perspective, it's actually very important to connect those two aspects, because you cannot map inequality if you don't have a map, no? And that is a very important thing. So then the next type of data we would understand would be functional data. And that would be things like statistics, both national statistics and also micro-statistics produced by every department, budgets, judiciary, parliamentary proceedings, and all that type of information that the government needs to function. And of course, here we start entering into a different kettle of fish when it comes to data protection and privacy implications. But the next type of public data, where we think that there are some of the biggest privacy considerations, would be data about the performance of public services. And this is things like health, education, performance of schools, mortality rates of departments. And here, that type of data has huge privacy implications for obvious reasons. And in the main purpose would be of this data would be to improve delivery of public services, to improve accountability at the managerial level, and also in some context to provide choice in terms of allowing people to choose which hospital they want to go to. And then the fourth type of public data that we're dealing with would be data around political accountability. And this is something very important to understand. We think that there is a fundamental difference between making a doctor accountable for the mortality rates of their hospital and making a minister accountable for the political decisions that created that context. And we think that that is something that is missed in many discussions around open data. And we think that here we should try to separate those types of information. And here we will also be looking at things like the communications of public officials, like emails and, and memos and things like that. So something around regulation. And when it comes to data protection and right to information, there are many models for regulation, and I think that I recommend that you read David's paper on the privacy and data protection to look at that. But something that is new when it comes to reuse is that there is a separate need for regulation of reuse. And that, at the moment, has not been very clearly defined. There are big discussions in Europe to the extent that this regulation should have bigger or smaller teeth, and how much carrot and how much stick there should be. But one thing that is very clear is that at the moment there is a lack of technical capacity in many of the data protection authorities to be able to understand reuse and to understand the different nuances of licensing or technical formats. And I think maybe Chris will agree on that at some point, and the need to build up some technical capacity in the traditional regulators to be able to deal with reuse and open data. So just to get to the meat of the discussion, so what we think is a big problem in this area is when we start conflating open data, big data, and personal data. And I think that it's not very easy to, to separate, but I think that it doesn't help that in certain political spaces, like in the UK very clearly, there is a public discourse ostensibly about open data that very quickly starts turning into personal data and developing a market of personal information. And I think it would be very helpful to try to separate. Just to give you some examples of what type of things are being opened right now. There is a process right now where medical records for pretty much the whole of the population of the UK are going to be made available to medical researchers in a centralized way, and in theory anonymized, although we think that we have lots of problems with that. Then the other, technically this is not open data, but it comes under open data in the policy heading when it is being discussed in the UK. No? And we think that there should be a deeper discussion, A, to the extent that you want to make this information available, but also to the extent that we should discuss it under open data. Then the other data that is being published is anonymized individual level reoffending and sentencing outcomes. So again, anonymized, is not very clear for how long you can keep this anonymized. I'll get back to that. But this is something that is being done right now in the UK. And then the third type of data that is being released right now is anonymized data around sick notes and employee absenteeism. So how many people don't go to work because they're sick, and the government has to pay some sort of statutory provision. And the plan right now is to share this data with private companies in order to help manage employee absenteeism. And that is, again, it's a very complicated issue. It's not clear exactly what is going to be released, but there are fundamental questions as to why, who is going to benefit from that sharing of your data and what is the purpose there. And then, there are other projects that are a bit less developed in terms of welfare, but ultimately the plan for the UK government is to have a big open data box where all the universal welfare payments are going to be shared as open data to a level of aggregation that is not, has not been agreed yet. Probably not, it won't be individualized, anonymized data, but it will be aggregated at a certain level, but nobody knows what that level is right now, and I don't think anyone. And for us, what is very problematic here is the idea of linking welfare data to commercial data with the aim of increasing value to industry. And that we think is starting to escape what is the remit of what public data should do. But then again, we should have a proper discussion about it. So just to go into some of the problems, specific problems that we have in trying to put together open data and data protection and privacy, there are very clear things on, So data protection compliance, that in itself is a really big thing. The European Data Protection Supervisor has published a really important paper on the European Public Sector Information Directive that I think that I would say recommended reading to analyze what are the problems. Some of the proposals we think that are very problematic. Some proposals to impose conditions through licensing, because we don't think that that is going to be really workable when you start looking at secondary reuses and trying to get people that use data that is being reused 3 or 4 levels down the chain to try to bring conditions in licensing. I will bring problems in terms of interoperability, which is one of the key things about open data licensing, that you can use anything that is basically Creative Commons compliant and start chaining databases. So, but I think that we will need to develop some sort of standard privacy clauses that could be attached to Creative Commons licenses to make them interoperable or something along those lines. Then, problems, of course, big problems with identification, where, it tends in health, it's quite specific to health. The proposals in terms of solving identification problems normally go towards anonymization. And from our point of view, that is quite problematic when you look at open data, because we don't think that is sustainable as a long-term strategy in an open environment. Then, of course, ID theft as a separate problem. We think that can be solved through other measures, like, for example, company registers. Data could provide unique identifier to physical persons. And then if you manage to connect 4 or 5 companies that seem to belong to the same individual, you could then request the full data set on that individual, rather than putting all the basic information like home and telephone number as open data. But I think that we think that there are a few solutions. Then what we think is a big problem in terms of open data and privacy is profiling. The police website in the UK maps incidents of crime. You cannot identify an individual person, but your home insurance will automatically go up because your area is now being deemed as high risk. Of course, that information was out there before, so you're not introducing really a new element, but we think that we may have to revise some anti-discrimination measures, if you are going to really make all this information available. And then for us, something that is very important when we look at open data or public data is to move beyond individual data and actually what we would call the data commons, which is if we are all contributing our little bit of grain of data to big, huge databases that are going to, in theory, provide a huge benefit to humankind, we think that we have to have some sort of public interest criteria and some sort of public governance for how we are going to deal with this data, rather than giving it all to private companies to generate the benefits, which may or may not go back to the public. And just to, as a final point, I wanted to make a specific case around the problems that we see with anonymization, mainly because that tends to be a solution whenever you encounter the conflict between open data and privacy, you say, well, we just anonymize the data and we solve the problem. And it's a recommendation from the European Data Protection Supervisor to make it compulsory or to make it a default to anonymize data sets in the new EU PSI directive. The Information Commissioner in the UK has just issued a code of practice for anonymization, and there is it's a bit of a buzzword right now in this area. We have lots of problems with this because there's a lot of scientific literature now showing that in an open environment, anonymization is very difficult to maintain, particularly when we look at areas where there is personal knowledge or you have a way of getting some extra bit of information around the person. In terms of the guidance from the UK ICO, we think that some of the problems we see there, which we think are lessons for anyone else trying to develop that type of guidance, is that we don't think that you can deal with the problems with algorithms of anonymization through obscurity. You need to make them transparent. You need to allow computer scientists to analyze what technologies you are using to anonymize data. Also, we think that in general, we should have an open peer review of the technology, and we should have a responsible disclosure mechanisms for data sets that have been compromised, where somewhere either the ICO or someone in the new specific authority could be notified whenever there are privacy breaches before those privacy breaches are made public. So there is a period of time where you can either try to patch the system or develop some sort of criteria before you tell the world that there is compromise there. And yeah, I'm waiting for your questions at the end. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Javier. Seguidamente tiene la palabra Alfonso Oñate, representante secretario de Protección de Datos de México.
Muchísimas gracias, Iñaki. Good afternoon to all of us. First of all, let me give the apologies of Commissioner President Jacqueline Pechard, who was intended to be here in this panel, but unfortunately she couldn't make the trip because, as many of you might know, right now in Mexico there is a constitutional reform underway, and that constitutional reform has to do with the design of IFI, our institution, and that is the reason why she cannot be present, as it was her desire. So taking that into account, and also taking into account that I come here in place of her, something that it is not easy, I will try to present an overview of how Mexico sees the open government challenge. It has been said at the introduction by Iñaki that this initiative, besides the part of the conceptual theme of open government, is an initiative that practically in the year 2011 became an international initiative, and now it's a partnership where different countries, in the number of 57 right now, the initial partners were 8, has established certain rules in order to address the issue of open government. I will come to the structure and the goals of the Open Government Partnership a bit later. First of all, I would like to address the first question that was set for this panel. And that question had to do with the fact whether open government takes into account or not data protection. My answer would be straightforward: no, at least in this initiative, it wasn't put forward. But on the other hand, we have to take into account that those countries participating in this initiative do have legislation and regulation that establish certain boundaries and some protection to data, and it is difficult to envisage how these countries that go into this partnership could get rid of this particular regulation? But the answer, I said, it's no. The initiative did not pose this question to itself. And it did not pose the question to itself because the goals it's seeking are completely different from those of data protection. Later on, I will come to the point where they mingle and when they have to be met and what questions they pose in that way. The idea that underlies open government partnership, and I am only addressing the issue from the international initiative, has to do with how to improve public services on the one hand, how to contribute to combat corruption, how to take better advantage of technologies now available, how to enhance accountability, both of governments and of corporations. They are included as well. And these aims has a common ground. The common ground is information that might be there, but it is not available and it is not efficiently used. So the big question is how to have socially useful information, because we know it is somewhere around. Now, one of the basic principles of open government has to do with the fact that taxpayers have already paid for the gathering, processing, and rendering of information. And if taxpayers have already done so, they might use precisely this information they have contributed to gather, to process, or to render to someone else. How do they become beneficiaries of this information? So, one of the alternatives put forward by open government is put that information not only to the side of the taxpayers, but allow them to do something with this information. And in order to do so, provide the information in a way they might reuse it. And for reusing the information, it has to be rendered in a way that will be not only accessible, but easily used into something else and to put value added by everyone who goes into the information. And this brings us to the concept of open data, also known in many occasions as raw data, and this poses a problem for data protection purposes. Because many times when we refer to raw data, what we are saying is there is no processing, there is no protection to that data, and data is just rendered in the way it is gathered. Well, I think this is a misconception, or perhaps it is an extremist position, because in any case, in all those countries where regulation have limits for the rendering of information or for not releasing sensitive information, you will never find in raw data or open data that sensitive information that might not be disclosed. But it is a fact that some information that lies in the borderline between the one that has to be protected and that might be released and used will pose some problems. And here comes one of the questions I want to share with you, because I do not come here to try to provide answers. I am just trying to share with you some of the questions that put forward the open government movement. And this question has to do with how to face the challenge? It seems to me that there are two different ways of doing so. Either we try to give general guidelines, or we try to reach general agreement, or try to produce general rules that might apply worldwide, or we try to solve problems in a piecemeal fashion, case by case. We already know that our legal systems have taken the two approaches, and we can distinguish common law and civil law precisely for that way of addressing the issue. It seems to me that those guarantors of both rights, on the one hand, the right to information, and on the other hand, the right to protect data, face that kind of challenge every day. And here we have ICO from the UK that has to deal with the two rights. The same thing happens in the case of Germany. The same thing happens in the case of Mexico until now. We do not know after the constitutional reform that is on the way. But that is an everyday situation, to balance or to ponder those two rights that get into tension. And they come into tension more often than seldom. And precisely it is by weighing and balancing a major concept in this whole issue. And that concept is public interest. Whenever one of these bodies, or a jurisdictional body, if the case might be, has to adjudicate a case where you find, on the one hand, right to information, and on the other hand, the right to protect data, you will have to balance and ponder. And one of the key issues, the golden rule for deciding and adjudicating, will be public interest. Definitely, there is some information that might be considered personal information, protected under certain circumstances, but whenever public interest comes around, you will have to withdraw that protection. That is the key concept. Now, how to address the tension that implies putting raw information, open data, into the hands of everybody in order to make it socially useful and in order to make it more efficient. That is the big question. It seems to me that if the piecemeal fashion approach or present approach is taken, probably it will take longer. Definitely you will find inconsistencies, and quite likely you will find that from one country to the other, the criteria will not necessarily match. And in a global world like the one we are living right now, where people gather in events like this one, precisely trying to reach common ground, trying to come with common answers, it's very, very difficult that we will find common answers to these problems. It seems to me that a different approach has to be sought. And the only way that occurs to me is that we might, first of all, try to seek in technologies, not part of the problem, but part of the solution. Nowadays, technologies have advanced in a way that probably they will render some results that might help into the solution, like some ideas regarding anonymity. The other way they can contribute is, in the end of the day, one of the main problems that poses open government to data protection is the question of disaggregation of information or disaggregation of data. No one would challenge the fact that its information will appear and be reused whenever it is aggregated, and it cannot be isolated in a databases. The problem is when that information might be disaggregated and might identify a particular individual. Now, one of the key points, and with this I am going to close my intervention because I have just been told that the time is almost over. One of the elements that seems to be crucial for the Open Government Initiative is the participation of social society, and particularly non-government organizations. Why do I think it is a key issue for open government? Because organized society becomes, being part of the open government partnership, as a control of those political aims and those public policies set up by governments, establishing which particular information might be socially useful and to what degree. So I think that will become probably the key issue in order to protect data within the Open Government Initiative. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Alfonso. Obviamente tiene la palabra David Banisar, Estados Unidos.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think we were asked 3 questions, so I'm just going to focus on the one that hasn't been talked about so much, which is on the relationship between the 2 laws and the balancing or harmonization, depending on where you're from, that you'd like to call it, between the 2 laws. So let me first start by reiterating that we are talking about 2 fundamental human rights. Both of them are equally recognized by the UN as fundamental human rights. Both have decisions or general comments by the UN Human Rights Council saying they are fundamental human rights. Both have been found to be fundamental human rights in international human rights courts, such as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights' decision in Reyes. So you can't just, and both have been adopted in national laws in 90-odd countries, though not the same 90 countries. About 60 of them are the same. So it's not just an issue that can be ignored, that the privacy advocates go one way, the freedom of information advocates go another. They yell at each other at conferences, and everybody says, I'm right, you're wrong. And as Alfonso mentioned, the Open Government Partnership doesn't mention privacy particularly. And I was at one of their meetings a couple weeks ago in Dubrovnik, and frankly, they had an appalling discussion of what privacy was. It was clear they were mostly sort of new people who had come in through the open data movement and only saw privacy as a barrier to what they were doing. But how do they really relate? It's been said already that there is no fundamental conflict between them. I think that's probably a bit optimistic, but I do see them as very complementary rights. I think Michel Gentot, the former president of the CNIL, said it most eloquently at one of these, I think it was one of these meetings about 10, 12 years ago, where he said that freedom of information and data protection are 2 forms of protection against the Leviathan state that have the aim of restoring the balance between the citizen and the state. So it really is about accountability. It's about how the public, citizens, balance these great powers, whether it's corporate or government, and try and give themselves some way of ensuring that those powers don't run out of control, that they are subject to the citizens. So I just want to focus, and this is an immense area that, Javier mentioned some of them, and it was mentioned in others. So I just want to focus on sort of one small aspect of it, which I think is perhaps the easier one to deal with, but hasn't really been dealt with adequately on a global level, and that's the holding of personal information about government operations and how public employees and the information that mentions them is made public. And I think it's incredibly difficult to try and say that public employees have a fundamental right to be hidden in their activities in what they're doing when they're acting as public employees, doing their official business, not when they're doing their private business, not when they're doing other things. And I don't mean by this that their medical records or their employee personnel files and other sensitive information should be made public, of course not. And they don't give up their rights of privacy just because they're public employees. But public accountability, basic democratic theory, that public employees are working for our benefit and therefore we have control over them, something that goes back to the French Declaration of Rights, means that we do have a fundamental right. The public has a fundamental right to know who's attending meetings on our behalf, who's making decisions on our behalf, who's spending money on our behalf, and who they talk to and how they come up with these decisions. And for us who are privacy advocates, and I consider myself still a privacy advocate after many, many years working for Privacy International and EPIC, this is something that should be of importance to us too. This has a value that we should be concerned with, because every time there's a newspaper story where a public official says, no, you can't know who came to this meeting. No, you can't know who signed this document. No, you can't know who the officials talked to in the corporate world when they were being lobbied on a particular issue. It undermines our moral ability to argue why data protection is important. It makes us look stupid to say, no, this is personal data. It makes it look like personal data is just the new way of saying it's official secrets. It's a state secret. And we were just getting over that in the world with the 100 freedom of information laws that we have, and it wouldn't be good for us to go back. So I see the Council of Europe Convention revision in the EU regulation as really a missed opportunity, that they're not really addressing this, and I think that will set things back. I mean, the EU directive, both of them, there's a lot of good practices in Europe. There's 40-odd countries that have freedom of information laws, and many of them, in one form or another, not enough of them, but many of them have dealt with the issue of how to deal with personal data relating to government operations, government employees' information. So, places like Ireland and Slovenia have very good provisions in their laws that were reasonably carefully crafted. The UK Information Commission has spent 5 years writing reasoned decisions on how to balance the two. But the directive, or the regulation, basically is just a reiteration of what was decided in 1995. There's a recital. The recital was improved a bit in the last round that I saw from June. But it's a recital. It's not anything that really sets out anything in law. And if you pass this regulation and all these national laws are wiped out and we start practically afresh, that's going to cause years of problems where we have to start this all over again. Teaching the officials that, yes, you still have to release this. And that's not a good way to start a new data protection regulation, by just having people criticize this secrecy. And I want to see it succeed too. So what I'd like to see, I'm just going to outline a couple of things, is first, I think, as has been done in places like Ireland and Canada and South Africa, is that you create a specific narrow exemption on what personal data is when it comes to government operations and others that are working in their official capacity. So, you know, things about spending, things about who public employees are, is not, or it's figured out in some way that that's no longer, it's exempted out. Second, there needs to be some sort of public interest test in there, because obviously you can't list everything that you think should be exempt. And while the recital talks about the interest of the data subject, it never talks about the public interest. So if the recital becomes its own thing, its own section, it needs to have something about the interest of the public interest in releasing the information. Because you don't know. I mean, sometimes there are extraordinary enough circumstances where even sensitive information should be publicly released. You know, in the last couple of years, both Nigeria and Ethiopia's presidents have basically died in office, and the public wasn't told. For weeks, for months even. They were dead. Nobody knew who was running the country. I think that's an area where there's a fundamental public interest in overriding the confidentiality of medical records. Obviously, those are extraordinary circumstances, but they do happen. Twice in the last year. Also, the transparency of lobbyists. Now, obviously, they're third parties, but when they are communicating with government officials to influence them as part of their professional business, it's really hard to argue that that is some sort of personal information that is sensitive in the least and shouldn't be released because it shows the accountability of the institutions themselves. Ensuring that corporate information isn't caught up in privacy regulations. So things like subsidies and contracts should become public. And Javier mentioned something about maybe company registers and ownership. That's obviously a one step further. That's something to be considered, though. And it's obvious that good data protection processes have to be put in place when the information is collected in the first place. You know, if lobbyists are going to lobby, they should be told, well, you know, this is going to become public. If you're going to go to a government meeting, you know, make sure that they know that, and that public employees know that things about their activities, official activities, not their personal activities again, their official activities are made public. And finally, the issue of releasing the information in data sets in some sort of anonymous form. Obviously, it's incredibly hard to do in a reliable way. So there needs to be further development of decent guidelines to ensure, if it's even technically feasible, to be able to do that. Now, these are pretty minimal standards, I think, because if you look at the world, there is quite a variance on what countries release. So, for instance, you know, places like India, they release food subsidies, they release public employment, how much people are paid for workfare, and other issues like that. That's obviously not something that's likely to ever to happen in Europe. In the United States, they put full court records online, they put government salaries online. Again, not things that are likely to happen in Europe anytime soon. You know, Brazil and Mexico, they put scholarships and other kinds of money that citizens receive to support them. You know, so there are a lot of variances globally, but I think at least focusing on taking care of government operations, we can at least move some of the discussion a bit further into things where we might have legitimate disagreements, and away from the ones where we shouldn't have any logical disagreements, but that take up a lot of time and just get people upset in unnecessary ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Christopher, please.
Estimados señores y señoras, buenas tardes. I'd like to begin by thanking our hosts here in Uruguay and to the sister organization of the ICO here, AGESIC. Can there be anyone whose spirit was not stirred by the sound of the Uruguayan national anthem this morning? I'm told that at 6 minutes in duration, we only heard a part of it this morning, it is the longest national anthem of any. And that's really, I thought it owed something to Donizetti, but I could be wrong. My contribution from the British perspective here is very much as one of those commissioners who's responsible for both data protection and freedom of information. I was very struck by Jose Castornic's diagram showing how the digital agenda here in Uruguay, 2011 to 2015, is finding that balance between the right to privacy and the right to know. And I think that's a very important consideration when we think about open data opportunities and risks. I want to share with you some of the UK experience which may be helpful. I should say that the... I was hoping I'd get one of these. Good. Thank you. I should say that the UK position is very much as enthusiastic members of the Open Government Partnership to which reference has been made. In fact, I think the UK was a founder co-chairman with Brazil. Certainly we are in the chair at the moment with Indonesia. We're also enthusiastically supporting the Latin American Transparency Network, and I very much look forward to bilateral meetings on Friday, facilitated by the British Embassy, with our Uruguayan colleagues in the National E-Government and Information Society Agency. So, I don't make a distinction between data protection and freedom of information. For me, it's all information rights. And information rights is a seamless garment. Open data brings that out very strongly. So my answer to the first question, does open data still protect personal information? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it has to, because you can't have one without the other. And while we have in the UK a huge drive in the direction of transparency, accountability, and open data, it has to be seen in the context of our very strict data protection laws, as well as our pioneering Freedom of Information Act. So yes, the UK government is driving hard towards open data, and the data.gov.uk website is a world-leading example of open data in practice. Why should that be? Well, there are some very practical responses to that. I mean, frankly, a lot of it is about deficit reduction. It's about ways of cutting out waste in the public service through sheer embarrassment. If we can all compare what different agencies are spending on different back office functions, it begins to raise some issues. And I suspect a lot of money is just being saved because officials like me don't want to see the embarrassing facts out there. Comparative performance, benchmarking of services. Our ministers, when they published a lot of information about spending in central government and in local government, called for an army of armchair auditors, that people can do stuff with open data and reach conclusions and draw comparisons. And there's a lot of open data journalism going on, and I think that's all for the good. And of course, efficiency, yes, but also the effectiveness of the delivery of public services. And that's where data sharing in the right circumstances also comes in. But the drive towards open data, I thought that the UK was in the lead by saying that commencing next year, our Freedom of Information Act will be amended to say that information has to be published in open source formats, reusable formats. And I learned this morning that the Brazilians have got there first. Well, salute to the Brazilians. So the benefits of open data: transparency, accountability, democratic participation, the economic benefits of business and enterprise developing new services, and I hope improving public services with greater choice and greater user engagement. But I don't want you to think that the Information Commissioner has suddenly become a cheerleader for UK government policy. Far from it, because my role as the Information Commissioner is to point out where the balance needs to be struck, because to gain the benefits, you have to manage the risks. And data protection authorities like mine have to restrain over enthusiastic governments from time to time, and I'll give you some examples. And I've attended meetings with the enthusiasts for open data, and they roll their eyes up to heaven and say, what is this man talking about? When I say, have you considered the data protection implications of this? Oh, it's you again, standing in the way of progress. Well, I'm afraid I'm not standing in the way of progress, but I'm making sure that these new and exciting developments can be delivered safely in the interest of all citizens, and that is about holding privacy and technology in balance, the theme of our conference. So some examples: finding the balance. Cases where the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK has been advising different government departments. Those are 4 cases. Pupil performance. There is a great drive to say that we should be able to measure the success of our school system and the performance of different teachers and the performance of different schools through a granular approach to data in the National Pupil Database. But if you break that down by school, and you're dealing with some single school areas, or you're dealing with some very small schools, you are in danger of not just identifying particular teachers, but also possibly identifying particular pupils, if you break it down by year group. So we work very closely with the Department for Education at the moment to make sure we get that balance right, that we get the most usable information without compromising the data privacy of individuals who this is supposed to be benefiting. Secondly, look at reoffending information. Very important, the criminal justice system. We understand how effective the criminal justice system is. If people go to prison, does it reform them, or are they merely recidivists? We need to know. But working with the Ministry of Justice, the conclusion has been drawn that you probably need to remove some of the fields in the data set, or you're in danger of identifying individuals in a way that is unfair. Or with crime data, crime mapping. You could pinpoint each crime more or less to the house where the theft had taken place. But in doing that, you'd be compromising the privacy of the victims of theft. So we have to have something that is at a level of granularity that is useful to be informative for the citizen without compromising the privacy of individuals. And with prescription data, of course, we want to know which doctors' practices are effective, which doctors' practices are perhaps wasteful with the medicines that they prescribe. But again, you might have a single practitioner doctor's practice, or a very small practice. Or you might have combinations of drugs that indicated a particular condition, which in a small community was very identifiable. So there's a lot of work going on to make sure that transparency and accountability and open data really work for citizens without compromising privacy. And we've got case law. Here is a High Court case involving the very difficult issue of what we call late-term abortions. You may know in the United Kingdom we have legal abortion under certain circumstances up to 24 weeks of gestation. And in the event of severe fetal abnormality, possibly a little bit beyond that, and the question was asked under the Freedom of Information Act, can we have the national statistics about how many cases are involved? And the answer is very, very few. But it was argued by the Department of Health that this information couldn't be made available because it was in danger of identifying women who had suffered a late-term abortion. And the judge ruled that in these cases, the risk of identification must be more than remote, substantially more than remote, and the test was a test of reasonable likelihood of identification. And so the data was made available. The challenges in the field of open data are clear. There are great benefits of getting it wrong, great benefits of getting it right, but severe impacts if we get these judgments wrong. There are risks around identification, jigsaw identification, for information that's already in the public domain. Are these risks overstated or understated? When can we safely use anonymization? Do we understand the limits of when anonymization will work and when it won't work? And it's absolutely clear that we have to manage very carefully the risks, making sure that it's joined up across the whole public sector, that we adopt policies of privacy by design, that we have very clear governance over the whole life cycle of the project, and that we mix open licensing and control of disclosure. And to that end, ladies and gentlemen, as Javier mentioned, we've been working on a code of practice for anonymization. Now, the code that Javier was very politely critical of was the draft code, which was subject to consultation over the summer, and some very powerful points were made. So I won't say we went back to the drawing board, but we've considerably revised our proposal, and it will be published on the 20th of November and will be available on our website, the address of which I will give you at the end. And this code of practice provides an overview on the benefits of anonymization, on the balance between anonymization and personal data, ensuring effectiveness of anonymization, though this is by no means a toolkit, talking about personal data and spatial information. Are we able to work things out by reference to postcodes? There may be other reasons for withholding information, even where anonymized, because although you may not be outing someone's personal information, it can in fact be misleading, because you may lead people to make assumptions about other groups which are not the intention at all. There may be cases where there could be limited disclosure, perhaps for research purposes, where publication was justified, but publication to the generality wouldn't be. The governance issues I've referred to. This is a code of practice which includes worked examples and definitions of different anonymization techniques, which I think is going to be very helpful. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, on the 20th of November, we will be announcing the start of a project working with some partners who are leading in the open data field. We're providing funding for 2 years to provide an anonymization network, so that we've got professionals working out how we can safely share information with best practice about anonymization, to exchange information about the strengths and weaknesses of the various anonymization techniques available for researchers and others. That information, again, 20th of November, on our website. And here is the address for everything that I've been speaking about on the ICO website, www.ico.gov.uk. Thank you for listening to me.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Quiero agradecer las excelentes ponencias que han tenido mis compañeros de mesa. Y es cierto que partimos de sociedades con diferentes normativas, que además estas normativas dan respuesta a esas sociedades diferenciadas, con diferentes sensibilidades, pero con los mismos problemas que se plantean, ¿no? Los aquí presentes, como hemos podido observar, tienen una gran experiencia en todo el área de transparencia, en rendición de cuentas, en apertura de datos, y es bueno, además, que esta experiencia pues, se vea en esta conferencia internacional. De todas formas, habiendo diferentes sensibilidades por parte de nuestros Estados, lo que sí es cierto es que los ciudadanos sí están globalizados y con unas demandas muy concretas y muy alineadas entre todas nuestras sociedades, ¿no? Aquí se ha hablado de una ponderación de derechos que no puede ir por caminos diferentes, como decía David, pero también tenemos que tener claro que ningún derecho fundamental es absoluto, como dice tanto la jurisprudencia de todas nuestras tribunales constitucionales, del Tribunal Europeo de Derechos Humanos, etcétera, ¿no? Estamos, yo creo, en vías de solución, de llegar a acuerdos concretos para esta búsqueda de equilibrio, porque si lo que está surgiendo en estos últimos tiempos es que estamos hablando de unos mismos conceptos, los conceptos que decíamos de servicio público, de interés público, de desarrollo, de conocimiento, de eficacia, de eficiencia. Estamos hablando un mismo idioma que contribuye, yo creo, a que se dé una solución. Los retos vemos que son los mismos y después creo también que la sesión de esta tarde en esta conferencia internacional de autoridades de protección de datos pues ha contribuido seriamente al debate, que sea el reto que tengamos en los próximos tiempos, que lo tenemos actualmente, de esa búsqueda de ponderación, de equilibrio entre derechos que parecían que estaban llevados al conflicto y, como bien se ha resaltado en esta mesa, vienen en el mismo paquete y hay que dar una misma solución. Pues muchas gracias a nuestros ponentes, muchas gracias por su asistencia y yo creo que es la hora de descansar y tomar un café, que a todos nos va a venir muy bien. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a los panelistas, al señor Iñaki Vicuña de Nicolás, quien ha moderado el panel, a David Basinar, Christopher Graham, también al señor Javier Ruiz Díaz, que nos han acompañado en esta tarde.